All right, good evening, everybody. Just a heads up that the microphones are not working, so council, just be sure that they're turned on. They are streaming. They're just not really working here in the council chambers, so speak up. Today is a little bit different. We're going to be doing all of our committee meetings before our regular legislative meeting. And if you have a cell phone, please silence them. Yeah, now I'm a little hot.
I'm about ready to crack a window. I'm about ready to pass out.
Well, let's not do that. All right, today's Monday, December 11th, 2023. It is 6:08. I apologize for being a little late. Today is a regular legislative meeting and a committee of the whole meeting. But before we begin with the regular legislative meeting, we are going to go through every committee meeting this evening, and we will start with City Properties, Parks and Recreation with Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. City Properties, Park Recreation meeting December 11th, 2023 at 6:09. Members present include myself as chair, Mr. Heidig and Mrs. Fry. Other members also noted and guests also noted. We have no new request legislation, and we have no pending legislation. So we'll open this up for miscellaneous discussion. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Do we have any feedback from the residents or the city about how the skate park was going? I know it's getting cold now, but the feedback?
Pretty good. Maybe Mrs. Iceman can help us out with this. There's been a couple of police calls over there or anything?
Been pretty good to go?
Nothing?
Not that I'm aware of.
Nothing major. So besides
Okay.
that, I mean, all good feedback and
Awesome.
new guests from out of town coming and using it.
Yeah, I see a lot of people there.
Yeah, it's been packed. Anybody else? Any questions? All right, seeing none, motion to adjourn, please.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
Mr. Heidig and Mrs. Fry, and we are adjourned at 6:11, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Jaber. Next up is Public Welfare and Safety with Mrs. Fry.
I don't have my stuff in order. You were late. I'm sorry.
You did ask for a couple minutes. I may have cut you short.
Yeah, I didn't have time to get everything in order. But I do not see public welfare. Thank you. I can't find mine.
It's in there, but I'll borrow you mine.
All right, it is probably still 6:11 PM. It is Monday, December the 11th, 2023. We are in council chambers, and I am bringing the Public Welfare and Safety Committee meeting to order. All members of the committee, which is myself as chair, Mr. Griffin, and Mrs. Coburn as committee members, and all members of council are present, as well as guests as noted on my sheet. We have no new requests for legislation. There is no pending legislation. And does anyone have anything for miscellaneous discussion for public welfare and safety? Anyone in the gallery? No. Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Motion made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mr. Griffin. And we are adjourned at 6, I'm going to say 12, because I can't see that.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fry. Next up is Rules Marketing Development, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rules Marketing Development, I'd like to call this meeting to order today, December 11th. We are in council chambers. All members are present. My committee and guests have noted. Tonight, we have no requests for legislation. Do you have any miscellaneous discussion for rules from the members or from the gallery? Hearing none, I need a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson.
I will second that.
Thank you, Mr. Isaac. We are adjourned at 6:13. With that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Next up is City Utilities with Mrs. Colbert.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call to order City Utilities. All members are present. Myself, Carol Fry, and Erica Bailey are members of the committee, and all other council and guests are noted on my sheet. We have no requests for legislation. We have no pending legislation. And is there any miscellaneous for utilities? From the gallery? Okay, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I'll second that.
We are adjourned at 6:15.
Thank you, Mrs. Colbert. Street, sidewalk, and lighting, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to bring to order the Streets Sidewalk Lighting Committee meeting. It is December 11th. It is 6:14. All members of the committee are present, all councils present, and guests is noted on my sheet. And I do have a requested legislation. It is from our city engineer, Michael Teodecki. He's requesting the necessary legislation to allow the mayor to enter into contract with GPD Group for professional engineering services for the construction, administration, and inspection services for South Van Buren. The cost is not to exceed $313,860. He's asking for emergency clause in order to execute this agreement in a timely manner. Any questions from my committee? Any questions from anybody on council? On the floor? No? Do I have a motion to call for this?
I'll make a motion.
Oop, we got a tie here. Mr. Griffin
Yeah, I'll second
and
that.
second Mrs. Bailey. Thank you. And is there any miscellaneous?
Take a vote.
Oh, I'm sorry. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Any miscellaneous? No? All right, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion.
Mrs. Bailey, second?
I'll second.
And we are adjourned at 6:16.
Thank you, Mrs. Angela. Environmental Health and Social Services, Mrs. Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call to order the Environmental Health and Social Services Committee. It's December 11th, 6:16 PM. We're in council chambers. All members are present, which is myself, Mr. Jaber, Mrs. Angeloff, and all other council members are present. All others are as noted on my sheet. We do not have any new topics of requested legislation or pending legislation. Is there any miscellaneous discussion? Thank you. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I make that motion to adjourn.
I will second that.
Thank you. We're adjourned at 6:16 PM.
Thank you, Mrs. Bailey. Planning, Annexation, and Codes with Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call the Planning, Annexation, and Codes Committee to order. It is Monday, December 11th, 2023, 6:17 PM here in council chambers. All members of the committee are present, which includes myself as chair, Mrs. Angeloff, Mr. Jaber, and President Greer. All other council members are also present, and guests as noted on my agenda sheet. We have one request for legislation, a letter from Pete Warsler, Planning Director, requesting legislation to amend Resolution 2-2023 to add tobacco shops and cultivation, processing, and/or retail dispensing of marijuana to the list of uses prohibited by the moratorium. Emergency wording and one reading is requested. Planning Commission met on December 6th, and there was a request to submit a recommendation to council. However, no vote was taken. as there was not a second to the motion. So this is coming directly from our planning director. If we would like to call for this, we will need to invoke Council Rule 702 to suspend Council Rule 302. Before we do that, are there any comments regarding this request? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. It just dawned on me, it says tobacco shops.
Correct.
What was the reason for adding tobacco shops in the marijuana?
We had concerns expressed to us that possibly new tobacco shops opening up in town could kind of be entryways for eventually future marijuana sales at those locations. And because tobacco shops are allowed in all commercially zoned districts, it may be harder to enforce retroactively if they in fact want to start selling later.
Okay.
Any other questions?
What's the term? For how long?
How long is this going to be on?
This should be until our new development code is complete, which I believe we're looking at March of next year. Any other questions? All right, may I please have a motion to invoke Council Rule 702 to suspend Council Rule 302?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
Okay. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And a motion to call for this.
I'll make a motion to call for this.
I'll second that.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
We have no pending legislation. For miscellaneous, I kind of just went over that, basically what happened at Planning Commission. And I do believe the Board of Zoning and Building Appeals has been canceled for this month. So that will not happen on the 19th. So, is there any other miscellaneous for planning? Yes.
Hi. You guys, you voted on the 702, but did you vote on the actual
Yes.
taking?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I'm
Thanks for
sorry.
checking, though.
Yeah, okay. What's that?
Any miscellaneous for planning? Any from the gallery? Okay, hearing none, can I have a motion to adjourn, please?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Okay, it's the same as the other one.
Can I have a second?
I'll second that.
What a
We're
mess
adjourned at
tonight.
6:20.
You have to get here early.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. Next up is Finance and Personnel with Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finance and Personnel, it is 6:21, Monday, December 11th, 2023, in council chambers. The committee is present, which consists of Councilors Coburn, Thompson, President Greer, myself as chair, all others noted. A few requests tonight. The first is from our Law Director Miller, requesting legislation to pay an invoice to Browse McDowell in the amount of $7,975. Emergency wording and one reading has been requested. Are there any questions on this request? Seeing none, do I have a motion to call for this?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. Those in favor?
Aye.
Next is from Director Flaker, requesting a temporary operating budget for the period beginning January 1st, 2024 through the first quarter of city operations or until the annual budget is adopted. A waiver of the 10-day rule, one reading, and emergency wording is requested. This is routine because the new year starts and budget comes after that.
I'll make a motion, we call for it.
Do you have a motion to suspend?
I'll make a
302.
motion that we suspend 302, it's that we do
702 for 302.
for 302, the 10-day rule.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. Those in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Now do I have a motion to call for it?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you. Do I have a
I'll
second?
second it.
Thank you. Those in favor?
Aye.
All right. Next is from Director Flaker, requesting legislations for appropriations within certain funds in order to cover expenses to the end of the year. It's the annual adjustment ordinance that both increases and decreases the appropriations. Once again, a waiver of the 10-day rule, one reading and emergency waiver is requested. Again, this is the final house cleaning, so to speak. Are there any questions? Do I have a motion to invoke 702 to suspend 302?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Do I have a motion to call for this?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. Those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Next, we have the finance report for November of 2023. Director, if you'd be so kind.
All right. Starting with the health insurance fund, for the month of November, our revenues were just shy of $406,200. Our expenditures for the month were just shy of $375,000. Puts our unexpended fund balance at $1,768,000. Our net year-to-date in that fund is just over $30,000. Moving on to the income tax fund, the estimate we had just shy of $1 million. We brought in just over $1.5 million. Puts us over our estimate by almost $3 million for the year. We had no transfers for the month of November. I did notice we still have one. I know last time I went over the finance report, I said all the transfers are done. We actually have one more transfer of $60,000 from a piece of legislation that passed in the month of November to transfer 60 from the income tax to general fund. So we'll do that month, well, this month, and then everything will be taken care of for transfers. Moving on to the statement of cash receipts and disbursements. Few funds in the negative, and it's the same funds as normal. The FEMA fund, that has to deal with the dam grant and the flood mitigation grants at 14th, 15th, and Arthur. Then there's the CDBG fund, that's our federal HUD grant that we received, and those were the only funds in the negative. Moving on to the last month of activity, general fund, you'll notice did decrease from September to October. That's just because we have no more transfers to do from income tax to general fund. So you don't have that extra revenue coming in as we have in the past few months or the past year. Special revenue funds, you'll notice that went up. That has to deal with us not doing any transfers for the month of November. Enterprise funds has been steadily for the past 3 months been increasing by about $200,000 a month. And all other funds, you'll notice, went up by about $418,000. Comparing last November to this November, you'll notice the general fund went down by about a little over $5 million. Special revenue funds is up by about $3 million. Enterprise funds is down by about $1 million. And all other funds is up by about $175,000. And that is all I have. Yes.
Thank you, Director. With the income tax collection, was there anything unusual to be $600,000 over our estimate?
I have to double check and look, but a lot of it still has to do with a lot of our estimates, because we generate it off of a percentage of the past 10 years of collections. So you still have a lot of the collection information coming in from CCA of how things broke out. So it could be just the timeliness of how quick Rita could process something versus CCA. So that could be skewing our estimate a little bit right there. That's a portion of it. But yeah, I can double check and let council know. I'll take a little bit closer look, but I don't think anything unusual, like super unusual, like some obscene amount of estimate came in or anything like that, so.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you, Director. Do I have a motion to call for the approval?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. Those in favor?
Aye.
Do I have any miscellaneous discussion from the committee,
I have nothing.
from the body, from the gallery? Seeing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. We are adjourned at 6:28.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick. That concludes our committee meetings for this evening with no objections from council members. I'd like to roll right into the regular legislative meeting. All right, seeing none. All right, today's Monday, December 11th, 2023. I call this meeting to order at 6:29. It's a regular legislative meeting, Barberton City Council. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by invocation by Mrs. Fry. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Heavenly Father, as the entire world is dealing with a multitude of horrific problems, we pray that you will intervene and guide all of our elected officials in making good and thoughtful decisions. Please open our eyes and hearts to the suffering of all your children. Protect our nurses, doctors, scientists, first responders, and military personnel. Let us all turn our attention to you and your teachings that we may grow stronger in faith and purpose. God, help us all. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you, Mrs. Fry. Clerk, please call the roll.
President Greer.
Present.
Mr. Heidick.
Here.
Mrs. Thompson.
Here.
Mrs. Bailey.
Here.
Mrs. Angela.
Here.
Mr. Griffin.
Here.
Mr. Jaber.
Here.
Mrs. Coburn.
Here.
Mrs. Fry.
Here.
Thank you. Approval of the minutes. So, approval of the minutes of the special meeting held on Tuesday, November 21st, 2023. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to approve the minutes of the special meeting held on Tuesday, November 21st, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to approve the minutes from November 21st, 2023.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the special meeting held on Tuesday, November 21st, 2023, as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Minutes are adopted. Approval of the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, November 27th, 2023. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting from Monday, November 27th, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson?
I was absent.
Mrs. Fry, would you be able to second the motion for the approval of the regular legislative minutes?
Yes. I second Mr. Heidick's motion to approve the minutes.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Fry to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, November 27th, 2023, as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right. Minutes are adopted. Petitions and claims.
We have none.
Matters requested?
They have all been dispersed.
Thank you. Citizens addressing council. I did not check. Is there any citizens wanting to address council? Thank you. There are none. All right, first reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 157-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Authorized Payment GPD Facility Study. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to GPD in the amount of $3,518 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Did I forget anybody? No.
Nope. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 157, 2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 157-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 158-2023, presented by Mrs. Angeloff. Title, Grant Application, AMATS. A resolution of the Council of the City of Barberton supports and authorizes the mayor to file an application to Akron Metropolitan Area Transportation Study, AMATS, for resurfacing program funds and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule, as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter, be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of Resolution Number 158-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Bailey?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mrs. Angeloff's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and seconded by Mrs. Bailey to adopt resolution number 158-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 159-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, 2024 Street Capital Improvement Budget. An ordinance adopting the Street Capital Improvement Fund, Fund 201 of the City of Barberton for the period beginning January 1, 2024, and providing for the administration thereof and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 159, 2023.
Thank you, and Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 159-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
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 Mrs. Angela.
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
This ends the first readings.
Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
There are none.
Third reading of ordinances and resolutions.
There are none.
Appointments, none. Miscellaneous and unfinished business. All right, communication from the body. Mind you, we do have a committee of the whole following this. Is there anything from the body? Anything from department heads in the legislative meeting? There's minutes. Mayor, do you want to wait until committee of the whole? Okay, thank you. I don't have anything. So with nothing else, do I hear a motion to adjourn? Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adjourn.
Thank you. And Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to adjourn.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? This meeting is adjourned at 6:39 PM. Does anybody object or to starting rolling right into the committee of the whole meeting?
Keep rolling.
All right.
Keep it rolling. We'll just wake up shorter. Yeah.
All right.
Raise your hand.
What you raising your hand for? All right. Today's Monday, December 11th, 2023. This is Committee of the Whole meeting for Barberton City Council. We already held all of our committee meetings. This evening, and I call this meeting to order at 6:40 PM. We did the Pledge of Allegiance right before the regular legislative meeting. I will ask again, is there any citizens that would like to address council? All right, there are none. We'll right into our committee reports. So we will start with street, sidewalk, and lighting with Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. Street, sidewalk, and lighting met this evening at 6:14. All members of the committee were present. All of council was present, and guests is noted on my sheet. We did have one request for a new piece of legislation, a letter from Michael Teodecki, city engineer, requesting legislation to allow the mayor to enter into contract with GPD Group Incorporated for professional services, engineering services for the construction, administration, and inspection for South Van Buren. The cost is not to exceed $313,860. Emergency wording is requested. That was passed out of the committee. We have no pending legislation and no miscellaneous, and with that, I pass.
Thank you, Mrs. Angela. Planning, Annexation, and Codes, Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Planning, Annexation, and Codes Committee met this evening, December 11th at 6:17 here in council chambers. All members of the committee were present, all other council members were present, and guests as noted on my sheet. We had one new request for legislation, a letter from Pete Worsler, the planning director, requesting legislation to amend Resolution 2-2023 to add tobacco shops and cultivation, processing, and/or retail dispensing of marijuana to the list of uses prohibited by the moratorium. Emergency wording and one reading is requested. We invoked Council Rule 702 to suspend Council Rule 302. And that's going forward. For miscellaneous, I let everybody know that the BZBA meeting has been canceled for this month, and we adjourned at 6:20. With that, I will pass.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. City Utilities with Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. City Utilities met this evening in council chambers. All members were present, and all other council members and guests are noted. We had no request for legislation, we had nothing pending, and with that, I pass.
Thank you, Mrs. Coburn. Public Welfare and Safety, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Public Welfare and Safety met this evening, December 11th, 2023, in council chambers. All members of the committee were present, as well as all council members and guests as noted on my agenda sheet. We had no new requests for legislation, we had no pending legislation, and there was no miscellaneous discussion. The meeting was adjourned at 6:12, and with that, I will pass.
Thank you, Mrs. Fry. Rules, Marketing, and Development, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rules, Marketing, and Development met tonight.
Yeah.
December 11th, we met in council chambers. All members were present and guests as noted. We had no new legislation, and we adjourned at 6:13 without pass.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Environmental Health and Social Services, Mrs. Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Environmental Health and Social Services Committee met tonight in council chambers at 6:16 PM. All members were present, all council members were present, and all others as noted on my sheet. There was no new requested legislation or pending legislation, and also no miscellaneous discussion. We adjourned at 6:16, and with that, I pass.
Thank you, Mrs. Bailey. City Properties, Parks, and Recreation, Mr. Jaber.
Thank you, Mr. President. City Properties Park Recreation met at 6:09, December 11th, council chambers. All members were present, and council members also present, and guests were noted. We had no new request for legislation, no pending, and for miscellaneous, we had a question asked by the skate park, and Ms. Iceman and myself said there was no concerns from the residents, and it's been going pretty good. And we adjourned at 6:11. That I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Jaber. Finance and Personnel, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finance and Personnel is calling for the following. Legislation to pay an invoice to Browse McDowell in the amount of $7,975, emergency wording in one reading. Legislation for a temporary operating budget for the period beginning January 1st, 2024 through the first quarter of the city operations or until the budget is adopted. One reading, emergency wording. Legislation for appropriations within certain funds in order to cover expenses to the end of the year. It's the annual adjustment ordinance that both increases, decreases appropriations as needed. One reading and emergency wording. And we are calling for the financial report for November of 2023. With that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick. That concludes our individual committee reports. Is there any remarks from the body? This is, well, I guess I got one. This is the last committee of the whole meeting for some of you guys, so getting close. I also have, just want to say that next week, Monday, December 18th, will be our last meeting of 2023, and it will be a regular legislative meeting. Since all committees met this evening, there will be no committees meeting next week. Is there anything from department heads? Mayor?
Mr. President, first I want to thank everyone who attended my open office hours this past Saturday. I want to thank the Barberton Middle School and Tom Todd. Last week spent some time at the Barberton Middle School working with members of Tom Todd and with the students and other community leaders. We worked with the kids, they presented their projects that they've been working on and asked for feedback. So a lot of great projects, and some of them, they've thought through them from start to end, planning, cost, all that stuff. And some of them, I think that talking to some of the other community leaders, we can institute some of these. So that'll be pretty cool moving forward. One of the best parts of this position is presenting proclamations to people who are truly deserving. Last week I had another opportunity to do that. Lula Jones gave her a proclamation for celebrating her 100th birthday. So happy birthday to her. She worked for the Diamond Match Company here in town. She looks great. She's sharp as a nail. And this is probably the 8th proclamation for someone who was 100 or over that I've done since I've been mayor. So really cool to do that. So happy birthday to her. Last week, we had a great meeting with the residents on South Van Buren about the project. That should be starting here in the next few days. If you've been down through there, you know that there's already been some work started with the gas line replacement. Our crews were just south of the scope of this project, kind of widening the road. Berm is kind of encroached on the road a little bit, so we were widening that. So there's been a lot of work that's already happened so far down in that area. Still collecting non-perishables for the Christmas time through the end of January, benefiting Backup and Salvation Army. So if you have any, please contact my office. We can pick them up. My office and the Lake Anna YMCA are drop-off spots. We have several businesses in town that are doing it internally through their own employees, collecting non-perishables, and then we'll be donating them to us. This month's health board is canceled. And then just lastly, it's getting dark earlier. The weather's unpredictable, so it's from anywhere from 20 degrees up to 60 degrees. So just be cognizant. Kids walking to school, people walking to work. Temperatures change, black ice, all that type of stuff that we have to worry about. So I just ask everyone to be cognizant of that. So, any questions for me? All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. With nothing else, this meeting is adjourned at 6:49 PM. Thank you, everybody.